What if the South had won the Civil War? What if, in the bitter clash between North and South, the Confederate States of America had not only survived, but thrived, forever altering the trajectory of world history? This is not simply a question of reverse battlefield outcomes, it is a profound reimagining of modern geopolitics, human rights, industrial growth, global conflict, and American identity itself. In this alternate history, we unravel a world where the Union fractured permanently, and two Americas, one abolitionist, one slaveholding, coexisted and collided through the decades. And beyond them, the rest of the world watched and responded to the shockwaves. Let us begin with the war itself. In our reality, the turning point came at Gettysburg in 1863, a crushing defeat that began the unraveling of Confederate hopes. But imagine if General Lee had succeeded, if the Union line had broken, if Washington, D.C. had been directly threatened. European recognition, perhaps from Britain or France, might have followed. With foreign support and northern war weariness mounting, a negotiated peace could have emerged. By late 1864, the United States would no longer be united. The Confederate States of America, now a legitimate and independent nation, would have continued to develop along the lines of an agrarian slave economy. Though it would have modernized in some respects, it would have remained economically dependent on slave labor well into the late 19th century. Its political structure would be heavily aristocratic, dominated by planter elites. Slavery would have persisted as a formal institution far longer than in any other Western nation, perhaps even into the 20th century, though under mounting internal and external pressures. The North, still calling itself the United States, would have undergone a different kind of transformation. The shock of defeat might have accelerated industrialization and social reform as a way to recover prestige and power. Abolitionism would remain a cornerstone of Northern identity, turning the United States into a moral counterweight to the Confederacy. But without Southern political influence, the North might also become more centralized, more federalist, and more willing to experiment with a stronger federal government than ever before. Diplomatically, the implications would be vast. With the North and South as separate nations, foreign powers could play them off one another. The United Kingdom, ever interested in balancing global power, might favor the Confederacy to weaken American dominance. France, seeking influence in Mexico and the Caribbean, might have pursued separate agreements with each. The U.S. and CSA would become pawns, and sometimes players, in the great game of global imperialism. As we move into the 20th century, the divergence becomes even more stark. The United States, perhaps without the drag of Reconstruction and with uninterrupted economic expansion, might still rise as a global industrial giant, but it would be a more insular power, more wary of foreign entanglements after its own catastrophic civil divide. The CSA, on the other hand, would struggle to reconcile modern economics with an archaic labor system. There would be uprisings, perhaps even large-scale slave revolts. Pressure from abroad, particularly from Britain, would force concessions. Slavery might be abolished in name, but replaced with apartheid-like systems of racial control. The two Americas would each deal with the challenges of modernization on their own terms. The U.S. would likely become a more urban, more mechanized economy, deeply tied to immigration and technological innovation. In contrast, the CSA might cling to rural conservatism, resisting waves of industrialization and clamping down on dissent through harsh legal codes and paramilitary enforcement. It would be a society polarized not only by race but by class, with a rigid hierarchy enforced by law and violence. World War I would break out in 1914 regardless, but with two American powers instead of one, their participation would differ. Would the United States still join the Allies? Possibly. But the CSA might remain neutral, or even lean toward Germany if Britain had ever supported Northern war efforts. The lack of unified American intervention might prolong the war, delaying its end and increasing its death toll. The balance of power in Europe could shift, possibly leading to a more fragile peace, or no peace at all. The post-war world would further highlight the split. The United States, battered but victorious, could embrace Wilsonian ideals of global democracy, perhaps even more fervently, using the Confederacy as a symbolic other in its crusade for modern governance. The CSA, meanwhile, would find itself on the margins of world diplomacy, increasingly aligned with conservative, authoritarian regimes abroad. Its economy, less adaptable to globalized industry, would begin to falter. Then comes the Great Depression. In our timeline, the economic collapse of the 1930s shook the world. In this alternate world, the crisis would strike two Americas unequally. The United States, though hit hard, might implement sweeping New Deal reforms. Social Security, federal job programs, and economic modernization could roll out aggressively, further entrenching federal power. The CSA, more resistant to federal authority and without the industrial base of the North, would have few tools to stabilize its economy. The plantation aristocracy might double down on authoritarianism, empowering proto-fascist political movements to suppress unrest. As fascism rose in Europe, the Confederate States would find ideological kinship in nations like Mussolini's Italy or Franco's Spain. The South, already steeped in racial hierarchy and militant nationalism, might admire the fascist model. This ideological link could have profound effects on global politics, perhaps even aligning the CSA diplomatically or economically with Axis powers. When World War II erupts, the United States would likely side with the Allies again, but the Confederate position would be more complicated. If the CSA leaned neutral or even sympathetic to Germany, the conflict in Europe might become more intense. With only partial American support, the Allied war effort might stall. The delay in defeating the Axis could lead to greater devastation in Europe and even a different post-war settlement. And yet, war changes everything. The brutality of the Nazis might shock even the Confederacy. By 1942, perhaps the CSA would provide token support to the Allies for diplomatic cover, while maintaining neutrality in practice. The U.S., lacking full hemispheric unity, would be strained. Without bases in the South, American logistics in the Atlantic and Pacific would be more difficult. D-Day might be delayed or reimagined. The race to develop the atomic bomb could become more urgent, with U.S. scientists working without Southern resources or facilities. After the war, the Cold War would play out in an utterly transformed arena. The United States, flush with the victory but weakened by logistical inefficiencies in a fractured continent, would be a diminished superpower. The Soviet Union might exploit this, expanding its influence deeper into Europe and Asia. The CSA, resistant to communism, would become a bulwark of anti-Marxist ideology, but not under U.S. leadership. It might maintain ties with other right-wing regimes, but refuse integration into NATO or any collective security pact. Civil rights in the United States would still emerge, though possibly in a different form. Without the South to obstruct federal legislation, civil rights reforms might come earlier and more aggressively. African Americans in the North could see voting rights, desegregation, and representation decades ahead of schedule. Meanwhile, in the CSA, resistance to racial equality would remain violent and deeply institutional. The divide between the two nations would grow not just in policy, but in moral perception. The U.S. might take on the role of global moral leader while the CSA is increasingly condemned by human rights organizations and progressive movements around the world. By the 1960s, the world is facing nuclear standoffs, civil disobedience, and a generational crisis of conscience. The United States might land on the moon, but its fractured neighbor to the south could be erupting in guerrilla uprisings or second-class revolutions. If the CSA ever began to liberalize, it would likely be through violent upheaval, a second civil war fueled by decades of repression, global embarrassment, and internal decay. Meanwhile, economic globalization would bypass the CSA. While the U.S. builds Silicon Valley and spearheads digital revolutions, the Confederacy lags behind. It becomes a semi-pariah state, akin to apartheid-era South Africa. International sanctions, trade embargoes, and public outcry would mount. Multinational corporations avoid southern ports. Students protest CSA embassies. It becomes a touchstone for debates on human rights, echoing the old divisions in an age of satellites and microchips. By the 1990s and 2000s, if the Confederacy still exists, it is in decline. Internal unrest, economic stagnation, and cultural isolation take their toll. The United States, having endured the Cold War, emerges as a solitary superpower, but it is always aware of the instability just beyond its southern border. Immigration from the CSA becomes a major issue. Refugees from collapsing southern states seek asylum in the North. The U.S. must now reckon not only with its past, but with the living consequences of an alternate history it never chose. In this world, 9/11 still happens, but the North and South respond differently. The United States leads the global war on terror, its intelligence apparatus sharpened by decades of conflict. The CSA might respond with sweeping militarism, aligning with right-wing blocs in Europe or Latin America. The shared trauma does not bring them closer, it re-emphasizes their divergent paths. And in the present day, the world is shaped by these centuries of fracture. Climate change, pandemics, and technological upheaval demand cooperation. Yet America remains too. A progressive, post-industrial northern nation seeks multilateralism, green energy, and inclusion. A fragmented, former Confederate territory struggles with corruption, inequality, and the ghosts of slavery. The legacy of a Southern victory is not triumph, but tragedy. Because had the South won the Civil War, the question is not merely whether the United States would be weaker or stronger. The question is, how much longer would humanity have waited to recognize the dignity of all its members? What price would be paid, in lives, in culture, in global trust, for allowing the ideology of bondage to survive? In this alternate world, the answer is written not only in politics, but in every lost dream, in every war delayed, in every freedom denied. This is the story of a divided America. Two flags, two histories, two futures. But only one lesson, that the choices of the past never truly stay buried. They shape the world we live in, and the world we might have lived in, had we let the wrong side win.